Well, like many people, I'm working from home today, working out, in my case, how to do church online. And it's just been such a surreal couple of days, hasn't it? So much changing and so much information to process and decisions to be made. And so I thought it would be good to revisit Psalm 46 and go back to it and look at the next sort of chunk of verses. I guess we're just sort of all sitting here slightly waiting for the wave to hit, if it hasn't already hit for some of us. And the verses that I'm going to read talk about a city under siege, which I think is quite a helpful metaphor for how we're all feeling a bit at the moment. So let me read it. We've had, if you remember, the first three verses where he talks about the mountains shaking, kind of earthquakes, and the sea roaring, but in the middle of all of that natural disaster and chaos, feeling confident because he's trusting in God and God being strong and a safe place and our help in trouble. And those ideas are continued in these next few verses, as you'll see. So the writer says, "There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. God is in the midst of the city, it shall not be moved. God will help it when the morning dawns. The nations are in an uproar, the kingdoms totter. He, God, utters his voice, the earth melts. The Lord of hosts is with us, the God of Jacob is our refuge." So we've had the mountains shaking, the sea foaming, and this idea of water, powerful water being stirred up. But then suddenly the writer takes us to a place of calm, and instead of this foaming sea, there's a river which is feeding into a city under siege. And it's a river that brings joy and gladness, I guess because it's fresh water that is supplying the needs of this city that's under siege. And the writer is thinking probably about Jerusalem because he's talking about it being the home of God, which in Jewish thought at the time, Jerusalem, and particularly the temple, the Holy of Holies, that kind of room in the temple, which where the sort of epicenter of God's presence belonged, where God rested and made his home. That's, I think, what the writer has in view here. He's saying in the city of Jerusalem, where God lives, there is security and there is fresh water coming in and making the people glad despite what's going on around them. He says God is in the midst of the city. God is in the heart of the city, and because of that, it shall not be moved, which is in contrast to the shaking of the mountains and the sea that we looked at a few days ago. But in these verses, there's some other shaking going on. There's shaking going on among the nations. So governments, empires are, it says, in uproar, probably an idea of war, which is where this idea of the city of sea under siege comes from, that this city is looking out onto the world and seeing the nations at war. And also it says that the kingdoms totter. So this idea that as the mountains before were kind of slipping into the sea, so these kingdoms are shaking and sort of falling down or at risk of falling down. And that seems quite apt. I know that our government is doing all that it can, and governments around the world are working hard. But there is this sense of shaking. Our financial markets have been shaken. We've seen stocks and shares sliding. And there is that idea of things being very much shaken. But again, despite all this chaos that's going on around, both in nature and in human government, the writer is at peace, is even able to rejoice, which is, again, I don't know how you feel at the moment, but that is an extraordinary thing to be talking about when the things that we tend to rely on as being stable and secure are shown to be vulnerable. He is confident because God is with the city. God is in the city. God is helping it. God is promising to help it. and he talks about the Lord of Hosts, which is this idea of God being the leader of a heavenly army. God is powerful. He is a warrior. He fights on our behalf. And also this idea that the God of Jacob is our refuge. He's reminding us that of that covenant promise, the promises that God made in the Old Testament to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, that he would be their God and they would be his people, and he was kind of united with them and promised to be with them and be their God forever. That is the kind of God who the writer is saying is our help in trouble, who is our strength and our safe place. It's the God who's promised himself to us, the God who is powerful to save. And that's the God that's looking after us today. There's just one line that we'll pick up a little bit next time. He says, God utters his voice, the earth melts. And there's this idea that God's voice, when he speaks, it has a more powerful effect on the earth than earthquakes or nations kind of falling. That's an extraordinary idea, that God has more effect on the earth than those things. And we'll look at that a little bit next time. But just for now, I hope that you're encouraged to be reminded that God is fighting for us, that God is at the heart of his people, that he is, by his Spirit, which is, I guess, how Christians would interpret the idea of the river watering this city under siege. God's Spirit is with us, feeding us. So I hope that you will be able to perhaps find some space today to meditate on that and to allow the Spirit of God to water your soul in the middle of everything.